On day 17 of the Diddy trial, reporters were forced to document every moment with their words rather than their cameras when press photographers were prohibited from entering the press gallery. Paris Jackson was holding a sealed white envelope, and even the most seasoned court reporter was unprepared for it. Instead of a label or emblem, she felt the heavy, tattered paper trembling between her fingers as she rose from the second row. The court clerk whispered something to the judge. Then there was a brief nod. The room fell silent as Paris moved closer to the front. There was something calm and unearthly about her face. She didn't move to get attention. Rather, she moved as though she were carrying something heavy. Her voice was barely heard as she made her way to the witness stand. But nobody in the room missed a word she uttered. She held out the item and stated, "It revolves around my father. Who sent it?" The judge himself halted, seeming uncomfortable. This trial was different from others that had seen public admissions, concealed audio clips, and dramatic collapses. Here, history was being made, not testimony. After receiving the packet as evidence, the judge carefully opened it and found one document, Michael Jackson's handwritten note. A murmur echoed, and the audience became silent. Michael's name was mysterious, contentious, and holy, and it was legendary. And now his voice was being brought in posthumously in a courtroom where Sean Diddy Combs sat just 10 feet away. Paris located a seat and took it. She decided not to go into further detail because it was superfluous. The judge cleared his throat and began to read the first line. It sounded like a thunderclap. "Some men in this field will steal your soul behind your back while grinning." Somewhere in the back, a pen dropped. No one stood up to retrieve it. "I've met these individuals. I know who they are. If my daughter ever runs into Sean Combs, I hope she remembers this." It was evident that his lawyers were moving and talking among themselves while Diddy stayed motionless. The courtroom had changed from being a venue for law to a theater for legacy and a battleground for long-forgotten facts. It was Paris Jackson, with her steely will and shaking hands, who had dragged Michael Jackson to a trial from the 2000s, where he had lately arrived after more than 10 years apart. Please hit the bell button, like the video, and subscribe to our channel before we go into further detail about this amazing moment. If so, you won't have to be concerned about missing any more films of that kind. Okay, let's go back to that. Paris had no intention of speaking that day. She had no intention of turning up at all. But the night before, she had a hard time falling asleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling under an unknown pressure that made her heart race. Only at that moment did the letter recall itself. Her father's letter, meticulously folded and stored in a security vault's fireproof box. No headline, no memory passed on from someone else. Nothing more. She barely touched it because it had no court-approved label. It was just meant for her. She read it again when she was a teenager. This time, however, she was depressed, confused, and looking for information regarding her biological father. The message at the time was a mishmash of unknown names, incomprehensible warnings, and sentences that read more like riddles than instructions. Before, Diddy's power struggles, manipulation, and control had all been pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, but all of that finally came together. That morning, she surreptitiously boarded a plane. She walked silently into the courtroom, holding the letter in her hand and lowering her head, because what her father said was prophetic, not just lyrical. When she got to her feet, everything changed. Paris took a seat in the witness chair, holding the judge's letter, and began to speak, not with anguish or rage, but with the odd poise of someone who was at last revealing the long-awaited truth. She spoke in low voices, recalling passing meetings behind closed doors and her father's raising of his voice only when he heard specific names. And Diddy was one. She said, "Always Diddy." She stared straight forward. Compare that to Diddy. It was reckless. "I was afraid." The courtroom waited for each phrase. When she was 12, she remembered her father telling her, "Some people build empires with music," when she was sitting in the back seat of their SUV. At the moment, she didn't understand. It is something that certain people make by exploiting people like me. Now look at her. She went on to talk about the letter and claimed, "He wrote it to me." She talked more strongly to his daughter than to the general public or the world. She paused to look at the defensive table and continued, He gave him a name, though he didn't use many names in writing. I choose not to be present. I didn't want to become involved in this. She clutched her hands and murmured, "My father saw it coming. But after seeing what he did to Zanaya, I was unable to ignore it any longer." At that moment, allegations and legal tactics became less important in the courtroom. Blood, legacy, and a father warning his daughter despite knowing he wouldn't survive long enough to do so were the main themes of the novel. There was a dramatic increase in the volume of his ink-stained voice. Her father had seen the darkness long before Paris had ever stepped into a courtroom, long before the trials, scandals, and headlines. Michael Jackson was a global icon for a variety of reasons. He was an idol, a legend, and a mystery. But to Paris, he was simply her father, her protector, and a person who had the ability to sense danger in ways she was unable to comprehend at the time. Paris talked about his mistrust of the entertainment industry and remembers clearly that Diddy was never just another name to him. It was a quiet evening in Neverland Ranch. The scene, with its bookcases and muted jazz music, was his study. Michael had a folder on his lap with pictures and papers in it. She had asked what they were doing. He looked at her gravely, in a way that made her feel exposed. "Paris, some people don't want your light," he continued. "They want to exhaust it. When you're empty, they go on to the next one." She was a young girl, too. She had no idea that he was getting her ready for survival. She acquired the folder with all of Dad's court filings, notes, and scribbled warnings after his death, along with the one page she painstakingly deciphered and produced in court. In it, Michael described a series of interactions, including invitations with excessive requirements, business pitches that looked more like ruses, and genuine smiles that belied hidden agendas. He named people quite precisely, and one comment particularly resonated with Paris. The sound of astonishment is silence. Contrary to appearances, he is not. He destroys instead of creates. At the time, Paris had no notion what that meant. She knew now. She was not considered a person by Diddy. He saw her as another name to collect, as leverage, as a legacy. As the letter was read out loud, she sat in the courtroom and watched him avoid looking her in the eyes. It was not just her. It was a pattern. The pattern of quiet, control, and praise persisted even if Zanaya's story took a different route. Is this letter, in your opinion, pertinent to the case? That morning, that was the only question the judge asked her. Paris was unconvinced. "It's more than just relevant," she said. "It is the blueprint." As the jury listened, there were gasps across the courtroom. The prosecutors bent closer. The defense shifted their positions. The jurors were also visibly concerned. Diddy hadn't said anything, but his attitude had changed, more measured and less defiant, as though a man had just become aware that a ghost had entered the room. Michael was speaking through truth, time, and Paris. Paris was no longer the only one speaking. Furthermore, it was impossible to muffle the words that had been spoken. When Paris stopped talking, there was a spooky silence that lasted for what seemed like forever. Michael Jackson's name hung like an unbreakable shadow in the courtroom. Silence fell, no papers being shuffled. The court then made an extraordinary move. He asked that the letter be read out, word for word. The clerk in the courtroom unfolded the soiled paper carefully as she walked up. At last his voice came out, steady and unflappable. Nevertheless, the phrases had enough force to stand alone. "Your childhood surroundings will mold you into someone you're not. My sweet daughter, they will claim to admire your brilliance, but they will also attempt to make money off of it. Once you begin to shine too brightly, be wary of others who profess to be talented. There are many who believe they can use your talent." Paris listened carefully, ear to the floor. Some men appear to be successful on the outside, yet they are completely lacking on the inside. Among them is Sean Combs. I've seen him lift people's wings and clip them, then disappear as soon as they touch down. There is no movement. When the time comes, you'll be strong enough to see through their lies. Pay attention to your gut till then. It's time to speak up when you sense that someone is keeping you quiet. Father, raise your hand. A warning from the afterlife, a lifeline thrown through time. It was not just a letter, though you could feel it in the courtroom. Paris sat still and stared at the letter as though she could still hear his voice in the room. However, some did raise their voices. Unexpectedly, Diddy leaned forward and muttered to his lawyer for the first time since the trial began. The jurors noticed a slight crack in his normally calm demeanor, not enough to garner media attention, but noticeable enough. The emotional impact of the letter caused his lawyer to stand up and claim that it was hearsay, unrelated, and just a family legend. But the prosecution didn't waste any time. They argued that it's accurate and predictive, not merely personal. They echoed Michael's description from before any of it was made public by bringing up Zinnia's testimony. The control, the manipulation, the same language, and the same approaches. In the end, the court ruled that the letter may be admitted into evidence. Instead of just one woman's word versus Diddy's, the defense team's approach was disintegrating almost in real time, since it was now a pattern derived from the remarks of a man the world had once called delusional, but who now seemed prescient. Paris didn't say anything else that day. She didn't have to. She had a responsibility to deliver the message. The courtroom was now assessing Diddy's actions as well as the cautions of a father who had foreseen the storm long before it began to thunder. It appeared that everyone in the courtroom felt that they were a part of something bigger than this specific trial. The mood had changed from nervous to heavy. Telltale signals included the slower typing of the court reporters, the faces of the jurors, and the additional quiet time in between objections. Paris Jackson had no intention of deleting the words her father had spoken because they were permanently recorded. Diddy's legal team was the next to respond. So what? The lead defense lawyer rose gingerly to his feet and walked to the center of the room, clearing his throat. "We are not here to condemn Michael Jackson's spirit," he continued, as stemmed friends and guests. No one had forgotten the letter, and no one could undress the words. So it was a clever move, humiliating, incisive, and intended to destroy the moment, but it failed, at least in part. To minimize the situation, a lawyer said, "He lifts people to clip their wings." He shifted tactics, displaying pictures of Diddy and Michael grinning together from press conferences, music awards, and public appearances. If Mr. Jackson truly scared my client, why did he continue to go out in public with him? He pointed to a glossy picture as he spoke. Without flinching, Paris leant into the microphone. She claimed that, as a result, he was aware of the repercussions of turning down powerful people. The air reverberated with the wave. The message that flowed through the courtroom was not a clamor, but silence. "We think she's real." The defense cast doubt on the letter's validity on the second try. Was this trial previously authenticated? What about a notary? Was it a good idea to write it legally? Paris calmly remarked that the courtroom was not the intended audience. Not all authentic papers require notarization. This one was made just for me. Unless they make you, you are not required to divulge some secrets to anyone. Nobody objected. Thus, the trade was authorized by the court. But everyone was completely taken aback when the prosecution used a clip from an old, grainy tape of Michael, an interview that had been found in the archives, rather than material from Paris or this trial. In his speaking, Michael exudes a feeling of controlled vitality. Some people trample others to the top. Success isn't the main goal for those in this area. To obtain it, they eliminate others. I won't name them, but those close to me have been warned. The letter's implication was clear, even though it was subtle. Diddy sat motionless, his jaw clenched, his body language revealing his feelings. He was obviously uncomfortable now. He was no longer in control. The evidence had become a chorus of Zania's voice, Paris's voice, and Michael's words from the past, layer upon layer, creating an unquestionable picture. And he seemed to be a man possessed. Not only could everyone in the courtroom hear the truth, they could also feel it. Even though the courthouse doors were still shut to cameras, the story was spilling out like a dam splitting outside. Michael Jackson sends a stern warning about Sean Diddy Combs to Paris in a letter. There was no film in the media, but that didn't matter. To cut people's wings, he lifts them. Already, the remark had created a stir, spreading like wildfire through whispered blogs, live tweets from court reporters, and television anchors who were attempting to interpret every word. But inside the courtroom, where cross-examination had barely begun, the rain had not yet stopped. The defense lawyers twiddled his tie as he got to his feet, trying to draw attention to Paris' credibility, which they could influence. He went on, "You mentioned that your father was afraid of Mr. Combs." Nevertheless, there is no public record, proof, or declaration from Mr. Jackson to that effect, and my client has never been directly implicated by him. Is it appropriate to use a private letter presented during the trial as evidence of this kind of fear? Paris was unconvinced. Does this imply that we must pretend that there is never any news of terror? She paused, then answered. The defense persisted, trying an alternative tactic. What proof do we have that Miss Jackson, or someone else, wasn't a co-author or at least a significant impact on this letter? Your youthfulness was evident, bereaved, and 20 years old. On the basis of this, are you possibly drawing conclusions? The jury would decide what was true, so Paris looked to them. I am not here to speculate, she said emphatically, referring to neither the judge nor the attorney. The mention of Diddy's name reminded me of my dad's face, which is why I'm here. I'm here because I listened to his whispered warning. You don't have to shout. But the defense was far from over. They unexpectedly pulled out a picture of Paris and Diddy from a previous award ceremony. She's smiling and gesturing. He seemed to be unfazed. Have you been warned about this individual by your father? The lawyer asked in a very theatrical voice. Because this is obviously not a terrorist act. Paris approached. Being in this line of work teaches you to always smile, especially when the cameras are rolling. That shot shows a lack of faith, as a sign of survival. The courtroom fell hushed again. The case was essentially over when the prosecution took the stand. Your Honor, a voice message is something new that we have. The private message that Michael Jackson left on his former lawyer's phone years ago is neither saved nor accessible to the public. The show must have started by the time the court approved it as evidence. Michael's clear, nervous, yet audible voice. I'm being compelled to agree with things that I don't. Even though they say it's for business, something doesn't seem right. Please don't go near Sean Combs. That environment must not be allowed in Paris. I implore you. The room became quiet. Not a word of remark. Quiet. Paris closed her eyes. Her face was devoid of tears. She was enveloped in silence. There was no need for that. The voice was too loud for everyone to ignore. Now it was the supposedly dead ghost who had spoken. Even Diddy, the judge, and the jury were unable to deny hearing it. The voice had changed from the letter, which had been one thing. When the voicemail rang, it felt like time had stopped in that courtroom. The last truth echoed like Michael Jackson's voice across the four walls, weak, exhausted, and unquestionably sincere. I'm warning, not blaming. And for some reason, that made it even more powerful. Diddy's lawyers were unable to ignore the shift in his behavior, and the prosecution sat in silent assurance. Since it was already leaving an effect on everyone's mind, they knew there was no need to hurry the moment. The letter was the first step. The voicemail was a blazing conflagration. Now, they've let the flame speak for itself. But there was more to be done by the defense. Diddy's lawyer walked to the bench and made a gesture that showed both grace and desperation. He raised an eyebrow at the court and stated, "We respectfully request that the jury be instructed to consider the voicemail as merely a personal opinion and not as proof of misconduct." He responded by making it clear that the speaker was addressing the defendant by name rather than an ethereal idea. A turning point was reached when the court refused to rule that a dying man's love for his daughter was only an opinion. Diddy finally dropped his silence. He came near, whispered something to his attorney, and then stood up to address the judge for a moment. His voice was angry as he referred to it as a smear campaign. His usual rhythm was replaced by something abrupt and less smooth. Paranoia was a problem for Michael Jackson. Nobody was taken aback. He predicted conspiracies by the government and aliens. Are you going to trust him now? The gallery murmured in response to his defensive, cornered, and unhinged delivery. But it was largely unrelated to his actual statements. The judge promptly ordered its closure. I'm sorry, the damage was done, and Combs took his seat again. You will only communicate through counsel from now on. The prosecution seized the opportunity. Estimate the jury's size. They spoke to them. 2 people have contacted you this week. Paris Jackson, who told the truth that her father feared would one day be required, and Zanaya, who spoke candidly from the witness stand. How many times must a man be correct before we stop referring to it as paranoia? As Sean Combs puts it, they paused to talk about it, then said, "That day is today." The members of the jury were motionless, and the weight of the case shifted instantly. It was because the past had finally caught up with the present, not because of some spectacular eruption or new piece of evidence. Paris stayed motionless, her hands firmly in her lap. She didn't say anything else after that, which said more than any words she could have. She had protected herself and her father's reputation, as he had asked, and now everyone could hear him, without ever hearing him say it aloud. More Than a Guy was now being assessed in the courtroom. It was assessing an entire legacy. Everyone on the crew knew it. By the end of the court hearing that evening, no one had left the premises. The jurors walked out of the chamber in complete silence, their faces hazy and their heads down. Reporters were running for the stairs, typing headlines before their boots had even touched the sidewalk, voices tight with hurry, phones gripped in their palms, not about legal motions or procedural wrangling, but about something no courtroom could contain. Michael Jackson's arrival at the trial with his daughter. Paris was still sitting on a long wooden bench in the hallway, her arms folded across her chest. Even through the walls, she could practically hear the growing clamor of tweets, podcasts, and commentaries. Suddenly, there was disagreement about Michael's meaning, the voicemail, and the letter. But Paris was unfrightened, because she had been raised in an unstable atmosphere. The headlines were in her native tongue. She also had the courage to allow them to speak this time, right now. The echo was more significant than the actual sound. Diddy's previously unbreakable reputation had obviously been shattered by the fallout from her father's remarks. Outside, a sea of cameras surrounded the courthouse stairs. Both critics and supporters carried banners. "We think Diddy is innocent. Paris is right. And MJ warned us," using hashtags and yells. The shared battlefield of belief versus branding was exposed. However, even the chaos revealed the transformation occurring beneath the surface. Many began to question the extent to which Diddy's silence contributed to his influence. How many people had had their voices suppressed? Did many careers change as a result? Diddy's behaviors were no longer as significant as what he stood for. He was the embodiment of the kind of authority that was concealed behind velvet ropes and billion-dollar contracts. Even Michael Jackson, at the height of his fame, had feared such power on that fateful night. Paris chose to rent a little apartment nearby rather than return to a mansion or hotel room, silent, devoid of reporters or an entourage. She took the letter back and read it out loud while she sat on the edge of the bed. "Tell my narrative if they ever try to obliterate yours. It will keep you safe." She put it back in its envelope after gently folding it, to conserve it until it was needed again, not to hide it, because she realized now that it was about more than Diddy or herself. It dealt with survival, legacy, and the fallout from not burying the truth. The following morning, the court would resume. Now, however, things were different. Calling Paris Jackson the daughter of a legend was no longer sufficient. She was now considered a voice. The day after Paris Jackson's testimony, there was a different atmosphere in the courtroom. The walls had not been altered. The judge didn't alter. But the electricity came out. It was as though a heavenly force had arrived and ordered everyone to stop acting, as though the trial had transcended some invisible barrier. In any case, few voices had been able to do what Michael Jackson's had. It traveled through time and space, making its way to its destination through ink and static. The courthouse was soon packed with people. After missing the earthquakes the day before, media outlets were rushing to cover them. More and more supporters, detractors, and supporters gathered outside. It had developed into a period of reckoning rather than just a hardship. Paris Jackson's presence hovered in the air like an endless closing note. Even though she was not due to speak again, every statement, witness, and question seemed to center on what she had brought: a voice, a warning, an old truth too sharp to ignore. And did he not in size, but in manner? The way he turned his back on the juror with his hands folded and his lips pressed together, he looked smaller suddenly. The guy who once walked boldly into the courtroom now sat like someone waiting for a decision he knew was already being made, for the court of public opinion had long since opened its doors. All eyes were now focused on the letter, the audio message, and the situation involving both. Suddenly, a fresh viewpoint on Diddy's prior relationship surfaced. The old interviews came back. Members of the old band began posting enigmatic notes on the internet. The once disregarded rumors about the industry now had greater credibility. The trial ended later that day with the preparation of closing arguments and a warning to the jury that the final week would be lengthy. No pyrotechnics, no hoopla. But the required statements had already been made not by eyewitnesses or attorneys, but by a brave father and daughter who dared to deliver his message to a courtroom that had long held the view that power could never be challenged. Paris left the building permanently without pausing for photographs. She missed a wave. "You did it for him," shouted a voice in the crowd. For the first time in her whole day, she smiled not in a contrived or scripted way, but simply as someone whose father's words had been heard, loud, clear, and unmistakable. At that point, something bigger had already been decided, and the verdict's decision didn't really matter. It is impossible to quiet a father's handwritten truth sent by a daughter who is courageous enough to accept it.